Our speaker this evening is Dave Gutierrez. He is a professional researcher, historical presenter, writer, and author of the book Patriots from the Barrio, the true story of Company E, 141st Infantry, the only all Mexican-American Army unit in World War II. His articles have appeared in publications including American Legion and War History Online, recognized by both the Texas Military Forces Museum in Austin and the National World War II Museum in New Orleans for his groundbreaking work on Company E, 141st Infantry. He also specializes in genealogical research, Mexican-American history, and World War II studies. Everybody online and in person, please join me in welcoming our speaker this evening, Dave Gutierrez.
Thank you all, thank you. If I can have a round of applause for Laura Sears, who's been very helpful. Thank you. And one other person I need to recognize, Rossi Salter, who's joining us here today, and he's a big reason why I'm here today. Thank you.
Of course, right, everybody? Let's try ending this year real quick. This feels appropriate tonight, everybody. We're gonna get it up. Thanks for sticking in there with me. It did work for us. We tested this, everybody. There we go.
Thank you. Again, thank you. My name is Dave Gutierrez. I'm a historian, writer, and author of the book Patriots from the Barrio, the true story of Company E in the 141st Infantry. It was the only all Mexican-American U.S. Army unit in World War II. What I'll be talking about a little bit today is my inspiration to write the book, the historical research that it took me to put this story together, the role that genealogy research took for me to write this book, and then we'll dive into the true story of Company E. I'll talk a little bit about how Hollywood has gotten involved with this story and some of the classroom successes that we've had utilizing the book. Now, I first was starting to do genealogical research. And as I started learning more about my family history, I started running into newspaper articles of a cousin of mine named Ramon Gutierrez from Del Rio, Texas. Now, as a child, I grew up learning all about Ramon. I heard from an early age that he had served in World War II, had been captured twice by the German army, escaped both times, making it back across Allied lines, would become one of only a few Americans to be decorated for valor on the battlefield by the Soviet Union during World War II. So I knew a little bit about Ramon's story because everyone in the family, we all talked about, what Ramon had done during World War II. And that kept getting passed on through our entire family. But as I started to dive into more articles about him, I became very intrigued with his story. And then I met my cousin Gloria Cadena from San Jose, who I had never met, but we found each other through Ancestry.com as I was going through and connecting with family members. As I connected with family members, I found even more. Everyone else had different stories of Ramon. And I always wondered, why hasn't anyone ever put this man's story together in a book? Everyone in the family knew about it, but I was curious why nobody outside the family ever talked about what he had done, which I thought was very unique. So I started diving into his history, and I thought, I had never written a book before, but I thought that this was such an important piece of history that I thought I should give it a try. Found out through research that Ramon had served in the 141st Infantry Regiment, an original Texas National Guard unit out of El Paso, Texas. Now, in 1939, there were 2 National Guard units in Texas. Company H, completely Anglo. Company E, comprised entirely of Mexican Americans from the barrios of El Paso. Company E maintained a 100% Mexican American unit, all through training. I have photos of the 1939 Texas National Guard unit. As I started doing research on the unit, I felt it was important to try to connect with some of the soldiers that Ramon had served in. And again, using genealogy research, I was trying to locate as much as I can on these soldiers that had fought with Ramon from El Paso, Texas. Alex Carrillo Jr. was one of the first family members that I found. I found his son, Alex Carrillo Jr. He wasn't too hard to find. He had his dad's last name, his dad's name, and he still lived in El Paso, Texas. Alex sent me a photo of the entire unit from 1941, in October of 1941, from Brownwood, Texas. I originally self-published the book in 2014. Company E continued training in Brownwood, Texas. In 1940, the unit was federalized and they moved from El Paso into Brownwood, Texas. This is the 36th Division now, and all of the other companies and all of the National Guard units from Texas that were part of the 36th Infantry Division would move to Brownwood, Texas as part of the training. Mexican Americans throughout Texas that were already serving in these Texas National Guard units, a lot of them were pulled out of those specific units. In other words, they had units like from San Antonio, the Dallas area, South Texas, and they moved many of those into Company E. But continually, they maintained 100% as a Mexican American unit. Now, all of the officers were Anglo, but every enlisted man of Company E was of Mexican American descent. And when my cousin Ramon joined the unit from Del Rio, Texas, in January of 1941, he was placed into Company E. The 36th Division, after Pearl Harbor, the 36th Division moved from Brownwood, Texas to Camp Blanding, Florida. While at Camp Blanding, Florida, the assistant division commander was a man named Terry de la Mesa Allen. So anyone who's familiar with the 1st Division knows that name. Terry de la Mesa Allen would go on to command the 1st Division during the Sicily campaign in World War II. But Terry de la Mesa Allen, at the time, in early of 1942, was the assistant division commander. And while at Camp Blanding, Florida, he ran across one of the soldiers from El Paso that he recognized. And he recognized Manuel Ornelas, who was a sergeant in Company E. Well, everyone in the El Paso area knew who Manuel Ornelas was because he was the star quarterback at Austin High School. And being the star quarterback from the local high school, everybody knew who Manuel was, including Terry de la Mesa Allen. And when he ran across him, he said, "What are you doing here?" Manuel told him, "Well, I'm with Company E, sir, and I'm with the 36th Company E, with the 36th Division here." He goes, "I know, but what are you doing here as a sergeant?" He goes, "Oh, my last name's Ornelas. What else am I going to do?" Before Manuel could blink, Terry de la Mesa Allen cut through red tape and placed Manuel Ornelas into officers candidate school. He became an officer in the U.S. Army. He would later command a tank unit at the Battle at Bastogne, the Battle of the Bulge. After Camp Blanding, Florida, the unit would train in the Carolinas and then move to Camp Edwards in Massachusetts, where they took part of a new training that the US Army was calling Ranger training. This Ranger training was conducted by British commandos. They had brought over some of the veteran British commandos, and they were training these new US Army divisions into what they were calling Ranger training. And I have a photo of one of the, up on the screen, of one of the certificates, and this is a certificate of Trinidad Perez, who was from Rock Springs, Texas, who went ahead and completed the Ranger training. After training in Camp Edwards, and part of that training, one of the last things that they did at Camp Edwards as part of the training was to do an amphibious landing on a nearby island for training. And that island was Martha's Vineyard. In early of 1943, the 36th Division sailed from New York Harbor. I think we're catching up.
We go forward, Dave?
Yes. Okay, right there. So I'll just tell you next slide. Thank you for bearing with us. You're fine. So they're in North Africa training. They're kept out of the Sicily operation, where Terry de la Mesa Allen was leading the 1st Division. After Sicily was taken, the Allies were staring at Italy. And the 36th Division was chosen to spearhead the Allied landing at Salerno, Italy. This was their first taste of combat after actually a few years of training. And here's a photo of the 36th Division actually landing on September 9th, 1943. My cousin Ramon was a squad leader, as he was part of an advanced squad in Company E. He carried the Browning automatic rifle. When they landed on the beach, they were one of the first units to hit the beaches. No artillery had landed. No heavy guns had been able to land. And they come across 5 enemy tanks. Their unit is pinned down by heavy machine gun fire firing from behind the tanks. Some of the firing that the Germans were firing at Company E shot and killed a few of the men from Company E. The machine gun was firing from behind the tanks. And later, Ramon would later tell his grandson, Henry, that, you know, I didn't think I was going to make it that day, so I didn't care what happened to me at that point. Ramon decides to charge the machine gun nest that he sees firing at Company E. He's hit in the arm, carrying the Browning automatic rifle. He loses the Browning automatic rifle. So he's on the ground, he falls down, he gets up, and he continues to charge the machine gun nest without a rifle. He throws in a hand grenade into the machine gun nest and killing 3 enemy soldiers immediately. He then jumped into the foxhole and killed the last German soldier in hand-to-hand combat. For that action, he would be awarded the Silver Star by the US Army. During the Salerno operation, the Operation Avalanche at Salerno, the Allies had sent a Russian observer on to see what was happening during the Allied landing. The Russians were very eager to see what was happening in this new front. The Germans had been fighting, the Russians had been fighting the Germans on the Eastern Front for quite some time. So they were very eager to learn what the Allies were going to do in this new front that they were opening up. And when the officer, the Russian officer, overheard what my cousin had done, he would later tell his commanders, this is the kind of action that will inspire our comrades back on the Eastern Front. Later, the Secretary of State, Cordell Hull, was visiting with the Russian ambassador in Washington, D.C. This was May of 1944. The Russian ambassador would later present to Cordell Hull a medal called the Order of Patriotic War, Second Degree, to Ramon Gutierrez from Del Rio, Texas. That's how he is decorated by the Soviet Union during World War II, which was an American ally at the time. Gabriel Navarrete was an extremely good soldier when they were training back. Next slide, sorry. Gabriel Navarrete was a good soldier when they were training back in 1939, 1940 in El Paso. A lot of the officers said, Gabriel, you know, you're officer material. You should go to Officers Candidate School. So they had Gabriel take the written test. Gabriel took it, passed it. Then he had to take an oral test. And after the oral test, he was told, I'm sorry, we can't send you to Officers Candidate School because you have too much of an accent. That was the reason why they would not allow him to go to Officers Candidate School. 3 times Gabriel took the test, 3 times he would, after the oral test, they would not allow him to go to Officers Candidate School. Gabriel Navarrete was leading my cousin's squad during the landing at Salerno, was wounded. He went back to North Africa, and after he healed and returned to Company E, he was commissioned an officer in the United States Army. Gabriel Navarrete would later on during the war, would command Company E during World War II. Rafael Torres, Sergeant Rafael Torres, was a very important piece of my research. Rafael Torres was my cousin's squad leader. And this is a man that I was really trying to find his family. And it took a while to find one Torres family in El Paso. Was pretty difficult. But I did find his granddaughter who was living in Marion, Iowa, because she was blogging about her grandfather one day. And when I finally made the connection and we exchanged emails and we called, we talked to each other, and she was able to tell me, you know, Dave, my grandfather, he wrote some of his memoirs. I'd like to send those to you. Maybe they'll help you in your research. Yeah, I expected a few pages. I got 200 pages of Rafael Torres's personal memoirs. So throughout my book, you will hear Rafael's own words of what was happening during the training in the States and what was happening on the battlefield. Rafael Torres was fighting off 3 other German tanks with a platoon. Rafael Torres was carrying an old Springfield rifle, fighting off German tanks. He was wounded when he tried to save one of his comrades or one of his buddies that got hit. He was wounded in the shoulder, and later he met up with Gabriel Navarrete, who was also wounded, and they both returned back to Company E. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring was the commander of all German forces in southern Italy. Now, Rommel, Field Marshal Rommel, was in Hitler's ear telling him to abandon all of Italy. Just forget it. Forget southern Italy, let's just go defend northern Italy. But Kesselring went back to Hitler and said, no, I can defend southern Italy. We can delay the Allies as much as possible, and I can make them pay for every foot of ground that they gain. And they went ahead and told Kesselring, let's go ahead and go with your plan. So Kesselring decided to, next slide, please. Kesselring decided to do a defensive plan where he had a line of defense just north of Naples. That was the first line. The second line that he called the Bernhard line was through the mountains of central Italy near San Pietro. And the third line is the red line that you see going across Italy. Hey, I have a pointer. That line he called the Gustav line. And that line was at Monte Cassino with the Rapido River right in front of it. So Kesselring's plan was to delay the Allies as much as possible while heavily defending the Gustav line at Monte Cassino. So this was September of 1943 when they first landed. In November of 1943, Company E was at Mount Rotundo. It was a small hill surrounded by other larger hills. And Company E went on to up on top of the hill and actually replaced a unit from the 3rd Division. Anybody ever hear the name Audie Murphy? The most decorated soldier in World War II? It was Audie Murphy's unit that was on top of Mount Rotundo that Company E went and replaced. The problem with Mount Rotundo is that it was surrounded by other large hills that were occupied by the Germans. And the Germans were heavily shelling them constantly, daily. They took heavy casualties at Mount Rotundo. In December of 1943, on December 15th, 1943, the 36th Division took part in the attack on the little village of San Pietro, where again, they took heavy casualties. Now, as Company E's taking casualties, the US Army wasn't looking, we're only gonna put Mexican Americans in this unit. At that point, they didn't care. If they were breathing, they were coming into Company E. So they were starting to receive replacements as they're taking casualties. Major General Fred Walker was the division commander of the 36th Division during World War II. Next slide. During World War I, Fred Walker was commanding a unit of the 3rd Division. And they were in France at the Marne River. Fred Walker's unit in the 3rd Division was in a defensive position at the Marne River. And as the Germans tried to cross a heavily defended river, they took heavy casualties. The Germans did. Fred Walker would later be awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, which is the 2nd highest medal, for his actions there, leading his unit at the Marne River. Now we fast forward to World War II. He's commanding the 36th Division. He just took heavy casualties at San Pietro, and now they're 1 mile from the Rapido River, the same river that the Germans had been heavily defending since September. It's now January 1944. Nearly 4 months have gone by, and the Germans were using civilian labor and just heavily defending this river. And Fred Walker gets orders to cross the Rapido River with the 36th Division. He's to send the 141st and the 143rd regiments across the river. Fred Walker knows what happens when you try to cross a heavily defended river, because he knew that when he was in World War I. He knows what happens. He writes in his diary, I don't think we're going to be very successful, but we have orders and we're going to go. We're going to give it everything we got. In a span of 48 hours, the 36th Division would lose 2,000 men in its attempt to cross the Rapido River in January of 1944. It's known pretty much as one of the most colossal blunders of the US Army during World War II, to take that many casualties in crossing a heavily defended river. During the river crossing, Ramon actually got spilled into the river. And when he came out, he had to come out through the German side without a weapon. He was captured and was being led back behind enemy lines. It's like dawn. They're by the river, heavy fog rolling through. And as he's being marched to the rear, he keeps tripping and falling. He doesn't realize he's tripping over dead Americans. One of those times he trips, he stays down, and the German captors that were falling behind him just kept on walking by him. He stayed for over 24 hours on the German side of the river and swam back when he could. During the crossing, Company E crossed with 154 men. Ramon was only one of only 27 men that came back from the Rapido River crossing. Slide. This photo is actually an after-action report of the patrol that took place prior to the Rapido River crossing, 2 days before. This patrol actually listed all of the men that were, this report actually should list all the men. And number 15 there is a gentleman named Russell Westcott. He was one of the, I believe it was 28 men, along with Gabriel Navarrete, who's now an officer, right? He's a second lieutenant now. He's leading this patrol across the river, along with Manuel Rivera from El Paso, who was a heavy machine gun gunner. Russell Westcott, who was a replacement, had just arrived with Company E. I mean, you can imagine just being right out of training, come in, and now he's gonna go on a patrol across this heavily defended river. Well, they get shot up pretty good. They run into heavy machine gun fire and stuff. Gabriel's badly wounded, and Russell Westcott was also wounded during that patrol. Here's a photo of Russell Westcott, and I bring him up because he's from Rock Falls, Illinois, which is about 2-mile drive east from here. Sadly, Russell, after surviving all of World War II, was killed tragically in a truck accident. He was a truck driver. Captain John L. Chapin was the commanding officer of Company E during World War II. John Chapin had grown up in El Paso, even learned to speak Spanish. The men of Company E, thank you. The men of Company E really looked up to their commanding officer, their CO. Because their CO, John Chapin, really took care of them. Several times, John Chapin was to be promoted, but they told him with the promotion, you'd have to be transferred out of Company E. And he said, I'm sorry, I'm not going to do that. That can wait. I brought these men from Texas. I want to take them back home with me when we're done. Captain John Chapin was killed in action, leading his men across the Rapido River in January of 1944. In 2000, a new school was going to be open near Fort Bliss. And they all the Army brass around Fort Bliss decided we need to name it something after Company E. So they went to the survivors of Company E and said, you know, who should we name it after? Every last one of them said, name it after Captain John Chapin. So in 2000, the doors opened to the new high school, Captain John L. Chapin Memorial High School. It's the first place I went and had a book signing event when I first self-published the book. Next slide. Yeah. So I self-published the book in 2014. And for the next few years, I spent a lot of time trying to get the story out there. I mean, I self-published the book and I needed to get the story out there. I have a subscription to a pretty popular World War II magazine. So I wrote an article and I sent it to the editor. And I say, you know, here's an article. Would you guys be interested in publishing this? And they said, no, we're going to pass on that article. I was crushed because I spent a lot of time on this article, right? I really wanted to get the story out there with this article. And this is my favorite magazine. And they said, no, thank you. I was going through Facebook right after that, and my cousin Henry had posted something about war history online. And I'm like, war history online? Let me take a look at them. And they had a Facebook page. They had 1 million followers on Facebook alone. So I'm like, okay, I need to get a hold of these people. So I sent that same rejected article to the editors of War History Online. And within a week, they published it with me as a guest writer. A few months after that article, I started getting email correspondence from someone related to Hollywood actor producer Wilmer Valderrama. Everyone know who Wilmer Valderrama is? He's famously on that 70s show. He was Fez on that 70s show. Currently on NCIS. So Wilmer reached out to me and I flew down to LA and we met with him. And Wilmer's plan is to produce a television series based on the true story of Company E. Since Wilmer first originally signed, both Wilmer and I now have signed on with CBS TV Studios, who currently has the film rights to the book. Again, you see the photo on the left is the 2014. That's the original copy of the book. And after Hollywood had shined this huge light on our story, I signed a deal with West Home Publishing, which has the new book out that was out in 2018. West Home Publishing specializes in military history, and they're out of Pennsylvania. We've had some quite a bit of success, and this is one of the reasons why I wrote the book, because I wanted to get this story out for military historians, but also educators. I never learned any of this in school. I was never taught how Mexican Americans participated in World War II. And this is one of the reasons why I wrote this book. I met with Scott Petrie, who is a high school social studies teacher. He teaches history, social studies at John F. Kennedy High School in Granada Hills. He said, Dave, I walked into Barnes & Noble and your book just jumped out at me. I teach in a high school where 75% of my kids are Hispanic, and I want something that they can relate to. Next slide. Well, his class became the first class in the nation to use my book as part of their World War II lessons. Had to cover up their faces here because, you know, we got high schoolers. So I continued also to not just concentrate on Company E, but I started looking into other stories that I could write about. The Iwo Jima anniversary was coming up, and I started wondering, you know, what about the Mexican Americans that were there hitting the beaches there? And here I got together with the family of Hilario Garcia, who was from the San Diego area and who was tragically killed, one of the thousands on Iwo Jima. So after writing that article, Scott Petrie, the school teacher, also used just the article itself to go ahead and do a classroom lesson just about that article. So he had them read the article, and then he has different exercises for them to utilize. Gabriel Enriquez from Santa Paula High School was able to read the book, and he wanted to install it also in his school. He teaches social studies and history. Gabriel had just purchased 60 copies of the book, and then the pandemic hits, right? But that didn't stop Gabriel. He sent the book to his students, to their home, because nobody was in school, right? Everybody was homeschooling and on Zoom. Gabriel then used YouTube to do lessons, and that's how he was able to utilize the book and to continue teaching it. I have done presentations at the California Councils for Social Studies. Love doing that because you have teachers from all over the state of California come to their conference to learn different techniques in teaching and things like that. And I was able to present the book to them. And since then, we've had several high schools come through and are utilizing the book in their classroom. The Illinois State Board of Education. This is from 2019 to 2020, their demographics in public schools. 26.6% of all students in public schools in Illinois identify as Hispanic or Latino. So it's an important piece of history that can be utilized for 26.6% of the students in Illinois. The city of El Paso, just last week, unveiled a new monument to the men of Company E. They already had one at another area, but they felt that nobody ever sees that monument because it's over there off to the side. It's not even in the downtown area. So a lot of city officials got together and they wanted to place another monument. And just last week, they unveiled this new monument. When they were putting it together, they reached out to me and said, Dave, we know we read your book. We know you're familiar with this unit. And they asked for assistance into making sure that they got all of the names correct. The other side of it, they actually have the T patch with every soldier's name that served in Company E. And there's my cousin Ramon's. Now, my other cousin, I have another cousin who's also related to Ramon. Served in Iraq with the 1st Division, named Ramon Rodriguez. Was wounded in Iraq and is a Purple Heart recipient. So I figured I better share Ramon Rodriguez because I'm here at the 1st Division Museum. And we're all very proud of my cousin Ramon. I've went ahead and completed a second book that I'm currently looking for a publisher. Oscar Perdomo was born in El Paso, Texas, moved to East LA at a very young age. Always dreamt of flying. He used to race cars up and down East LA area. but he always dreamt of flying. He would later on become the last American ace in a day of World War II. Now, you all familiar with the term ace in the military? In order to become an ace in the military, this is every pilot's dream, to be named an ace. You would have to shoot down 5 enemy planes. Oscar Perdomo does that in 1 day. 2 days before Japan surrendered, Oscar, here's a photo of Oscar in his P-47. Oscar's unit goes up and they're swarmed with Japanese fighters. Now, the Americans we had already dropped 2 atomic bombs on Japan and they had not surrendered yet. He goes up on a mission on August 13th, 1945. And his squadron is just swarmed with Zeros. He shoots down 5 enemy planes and returns back. He becomes the last American ace in a day of World War II. And not very many people know his story. I just happened to come across it when I was reading some article and it mentioned 2 sentences about him. I quickly started doing his genealogy research and found his son. And his son was able to help me put his story together. Then I turned around and used genealogy research when I got a roster of the entire squadron and went ahead and found a lot of the family members of the men that he flew with to be able to tell their story. Here's an artistic view of his P-47 fighter plane. They were actually flying out of Lashima, which is an island just off of Okinawa. If anyone's familiar with that island, it's the island where Ernie Pyle was killed. The famous correspondent Ernie Pyle, who had written a famous article and became famous himself with that article when he was in Italy. The book, Patriots from the Barrio, is available on barnesandnoble.com. It's available on amazon.com. And just a few months ago, we were on audible.com. So you can actually listen to the book now. You can follow us on Facebook. I have had a Facebook page dedicated to the men of Company E, even before I published the story. I have a website, authordavegutierrez.com, where you can find out where I have events, such as the 1st Division Museum. I'm also on Twitter and Instagram. You can follow me there. And now I have some time for questions and answers.
All right, everybody, if we can get a round of applause. I'm going to share the podium with Dave as we go through our Q&As. So instructions for Q&As this evening, everybody. If you're watching us virtually on Zoom, you can go ahead and use the Q&A feature on your screen to submit questions. Should you have any, we'll be getting along to them. So you're going to use that Q&A button you should see probably at the bottom or the top of your screen. So you're going to get questions to us virtually. For those of us who are joining us in person, my wonderful colleague and friend Jackie is here to give us a hand. We're going to do this old-fashioned style, everybody. If you have a question, you know what to do. Raise your hand. Jackie's going to come along and let you know when it's your turn. We have this question starting off for us here online, if that's okay, Dave. Yep. So one of our guests online wants to know, were there any female Mexican-American military history heroes we should know about?
And this is female Mexican-American.
Yeah.
Okay. So first of all, at the time when Ramon was serving, he had a girlfriend back home. Her name was Connie Garza. And we actually have someone in our audience today who's actually related to Connie Garza. Elva Wright. Thank you for making the trip. And you made the trip from Pennsylvania? Thank you for being here. So Ramon's girlfriend at the time was a young lady named Connie Garza. Well, she knew that Ramon had been with the Texas National Guard unit. They had been federalized, and now these men from the barrios are all of a sudden in the middle of World War II. She decides to enlist as a U.S. Navy wave. And later when she was interviewed, they said, well, what made you go become a U.S. Navy wave? She goes, well, I was just hoping to run into Ramon somewhere. You can learn actually more about her story here at the exhibit, here at the 1st Division Museum. The Mexican-American Experience actually has a photo of Connie and her story.
Awesome. Thank you for plugging the exhibit for me. I was getting ready to be, no, if you want to learn more, come to the exhibit, but please do. And because we are all Friends of Date with History series, it is not being advertised yet, but it is coming. But we're also going to have a presentation later in the year from a book that is called From Zoot Suits to Coveralls, which focuses on the story of Mexican-American Rosies during World War II. So stay tuned if that's something you're interested in. We're going to be learning a lot more about that throughout the year. All right, do I have any questions from the audience? And then I'm going to continue online. Perfect. We have another question online. How long did it take you to research, write, and finally publish Patriots from the Barrio?
Oh, good question. Again, very good question, and thank you for that. I spent 5 years of research. This was the first book I ever wrote. I had never written a book, and a lot of the research was learning how to write a book. To me, I've always been a military buff, a historical buff. So that part of it to me was fun. That research was always the fun part of it. I basically, when I found out that Ramon had served in the 36th Infantry Division, I read everything that anybody had ever written about the 36th Infantry Division. And I talked a little bit about my presentation about Albert Kesselring, the German officer. And the reason why I have a lot of what he was thinking in my book was because I read his memoir. He actually, he had been arrested, was in jail, but he actually published his memoirs. And I wanted to get an idea of what he was thinking when he was commanding the German forces in Italy. But yeah, it took me 5 years to write the book. But really the foundation for me was genealogy research, because I was able to connect with over 60 different families of the men that served with my cousin Ramon during World War II. And the great part about all of that is that now that we get to continue that bond that was forged over 70 years ago by some very heroic men. Thank you, Pat.
Great question. All right, as we move forward with some of these questions, did they use Spanish to protect communications from the enemy? Something like how maybe the Navajo code talkers would have utilized it. Another great question.
Yeah, they use Spanish a lot within themselves. As a matter of fact, a lot of the men during the Rapido River crossing, and now a lot of the men were killed crossing over the Rapido River, but a great many of them were taken prisoner. And when they were taken prisoner, they were speaking to each other in Spanish. Some of the Germans actually thought that they were part of the Mexican army, that Mexico had somehow joined the Allies and they had not heard about this. And they got a kick out of hearing this. A lot of the men that were captured spent 16 months in German POW camps before they were liberated and made their way back home. But they had a lot of stories to tell. One of them was Ricardo Palacios Jr. from El Paso, one of the very few of the men that was still alive when I was first writing the book. And the way he described it when he was first captured and they were speaking Spanish, they really thought that the Mexican army had joined the Allied forces. Thank you.
All right, as we move forward, I want to remind everybody this evening that the gift shop at Cantini Park is open, so you are able to get a copy of Dave's book this evening, or if you're coming by this weekend to check out the exhibit that's at the museum here at our gift shop. And Dave will be available in person this evening to sign copies of the books, just for tonight only, though, my friends. All right, let's move on to our next question. I just wanted to let you know that this was such an excellent presentation. I wanted to know if you were familiar with the book Mexicans at War, Mexican Military Aviation in the Second World War from 1941 to 1945. You read that one yet?
I don't think so. I think I have heard of it. I'd have to be introduced to the author. I know more books about the authors, but yeah, a lot of the research was reading a lot about how Mexican Americans had served, because here I am, I'm going to tell this story of the only all Mexican American U.S. Army unit in World War II. Now, when people hear that, they go, "But Dave, you know, there was other Mexicans that served." Yes, there were. And that's what made Company E very unique. From the very beginning, they were the only such unit that was comprised entirely of Mexican Americans. We had Mexican Americans. I talked a little bit about my new book coming out about Oscar Perdomo, who was a pilot, a P-47 pilot. They served in the Navy. You know, they served all across the military. And I believe the number is something like 250,000 Mexican Americans that served during World War II.
Excellent. And as always, my friends, we always have a lot of questions coming in, so we're going to get to as many of these as possible. In comparison to other ethnicities, how many Latino/Hispanics were decorated in World War II? Do we know?
I would say numerous were decorated, but at the time, there were, I'm talking Medal of Honors here. There were 13 Medal of Honor winners that were of Hispanic descent. Okay, one of the first from World War II was, I'm hoping to remember his name now, Mr. Rodriguez, he was part of a unit that was fighting in the Aleutian Islands. They had tried to kick the Japanese who had actually landed on the Aleutian Islands off. He was one of the first to be awarded the Medal of Honor. Now, what was unique about his story is that he's awarded the Medal of Honor for defending American soil during that time.
Again, a great story. So I encourage you to look more up about that individual. All right. So this gentleman who is checking out, he says, great presentation. His grandfather was Private First Class Lucas Flores, and he served and is listed in as a chaplain on the memorial that we talked about. Do we have any ideas when the TV show may come out? Any spoilers?
I do not have an update on that. I do know that CBS TV Studios has announcements coming out about that. So I'm eager to share that with everyone, but I do have to wait for Hollywood to make their announcements.
All right, everybody, we tried. We weren't able to get it out of him tonight. All right, I have time for one more question. So for everybody in the audience, I'll still make sure I get to you. Should we have any last minute questions from here in person? This will be my last one from online today. Okay, finally, I'll take two more. I see the last one came in last second. I'm a pushover for the questions. Did the men in the company experience any prejudices while serving within the company?
Good question. Good question. I just spoke briefly about Gabriel Navarrete. Gabriel Navarrete was the one who had taken the officer's test, and he was denied because they said he had too much of an accent. Gabriel, at the time, had just been promoted to sergeant while they were in Brownwood at Camp Bowie. So they said, "Oh, let's go celebrate in town." There's not much to do in 1939 in Brownwood, Texas at the time. There was a hamburger shop, and they all went into the hamburger joint to get hamburgers and shakes. That was going to be their celebration. They did not see the sign on the window that said, "No Mexicans or dogs allowed. Now, the men were told that they couldn't be there and they had to leave. And if they wanted food, they had to go around to the back door to get the food. They wanted to bust up the joint. Gabriel talked them out of it, and Gabriel later went back to the base and told Captain John Chapin about it. Captain John Chapin and a full bird colonel went back to the hamburger joint and said, why aren't you serving these men that are serving in the US Army? And the owner, who was a lady, said, I don't care who they are, we don't serve Mexicans. So you could take your Mexicans and leave. The colonel went back to the base and said, okay, that's fine. He put out an order that said, no military from this base will be at that establishment. If you are, if we find you there, you're going to be court-martialed. Well, that establishment was losing money fast. So she went back to the base and said, okay, we'll serve all of anyone who's in the US Army. They did allow the men to go back to the hamburger joint, but not until she paid a $500 fine. But yeah, there was that prejudice that was still going on at the time. Good question.
Great question. I told you they ask great questions. All right, this is gonna be our last question for the evening, and it looks like this is coming to us from one of our educators. So again, special hello to all of our Illinois State educators, especially those who are receiving their teacher professional development, for joining us tonight. So this question is, as a US history teacher with so many Mexican-American students and Mexican students, they always ask what contributions did Mexican make? So this was such a wonderful resource for my students. Could you share any other additional resources that our Illinois State teachers might be able to utilize?
Resources. I would say places like the First Division Museum is a good place. The Pritzker Military Museum in Chicago is there. I'd reach out to the National World War II Museum, the National World War II Memorial Museum. I would actually reach out to the local veterans groups. A lot of the veterans groups have that piece of the story of individual soldiers that they may point you in the right direction for that. But here's a good question, because, and one of the reasons why I wrote the book is because, again, we don't see a lot of this out there on Hispanics in the military. Individual stories like this, or unit stories like this. And again, it's one of the reasons why I wrote the book. We as Latinos, Hispanics, have got to get better at recording and documenting our own history. And this is one example of that, because no one's going to do it for us. It shouldn't have taken 70 years for the true story of the men of Company E to come to light. And I really wish this book should have been written 50 years ago. And I know Ramon probably would have wanted it that way too.
Amazing. So again, for all of my friends who are in person, let's give Dave a wonderful round of applause. I'm giving that from all of our virtual guests over today. Thank you so much, everybody. You guys, we did it. We got through the presentation. It was wonderful. We had a wonderful time together. For my friends who are here in person, please remember that our gift shop is open. If you'd like to purchase a copy of Dave's book this evening, he is available for signing books. In fact, Karofsky, can you raise your hand up real high for me? Dave's going to be back there at that table to sign copies of the book, should you like to do so. Or if you just want to say hello, a quick chat, he's welcome for that as well. Thank you so much, everybody. Have a wonderful evening. Thank you to all of our veterans who are joining us. And a final push for, if you're here in person this evening, our friends from Cantini Post 556 are here tonight collecting donations for the Midwest Shelter for Homeless Veterans. Thank you so much, everybody. Good night. Have a wonderful evening, and we'll see you next month.